You are looking at a home where 80 mice have been caught, and the infestation is worse than when they started. 2 major pest control companies gave up. An exclusion specialist walked away. But the real problem wasn't the rodents. It was what the homeowners refused to use: standard poison. Because in a house with chickens, a pig, a dog, and a family that watched a neighbor's cat die from eating a poisoned mouse, the cure was as dangerous as the problem. What this expert brought instead were 2 weapons the industry barely talks about. One you can mix in your kitchen tonight, and the other kills rats without killing whatever eats the rat. He's the expert called when the national chains have already quit. The homeowners had one rule: nothing that could kill their dog, their pig, or their chickens. So he brought 2 solutions: a kitchen recipe and a pill that vanish from a carcass before the predators can arrive. But when he opened that crawlspace door, he realized the rats had been preparing for him for months. The crawlspace was a museum of every failure that came before him. Chewed bait blocks from the national chains, untouched for weeks. Loose poison pellets scattered in corners, now just bedding for the next generation. Snap traps, glue boards, ultrasonic repellers still blinking in the dark. Mackenzie, his helper, crouched beside him and whispered a number that made the air feel colder. 400. That's how many droppings they'd counted in a single square yard of insulation. The technician from the second company had left a note on his invoice: untreatable, recommend demolition. That invoice was still taped to the furnace when they arrived. The family had tried everything the industry sells. Orkin came first. They laid standard bromadiolone blocks in every room, and came back a week later to find feces on top of the bait stations. A territorial signal from a colony that had learned to ignore poison. Terminix followed with more aggressive second-generation anticoagulants, the kind that kill in a single feeding. But a week later, the homeowner found one of the chickens pecking at a dying rat in the yard. She called the vet in a panic. The vet told her that one poisoned rodent contains enough toxin to kill a 40-pound dog. The family threw out every bait block that same day. That's when the exclusion specialist arrived, a man who charges thousands just to find the entry points. He sealed 17 gaps in the foundation, installed steel mesh over every vent, and declared the home rodent-proof. 2 days later, a rat chewed through the drywall behind the refrigerator and walked into the kitchen. While the children were eating breakfast, the family caught it in a trash can. Its teeth had worn through the steel mesh like it was paper. By the time this expert pulled into the driveway, the homeowners had one condition: nothing synthetic. Nothing that transfers, nothing that puts their animals at risk. So he brought 2 substances that almost nobody in pest control talks about. The first was a box of cheap cornbread mix, a carton of baking soda, and a bottle of pancake soda. The second was a professional bait called Kaput, whose active ingredient is warfarin, the same blood thinner given to human stroke patients. But what the warfarin does inside a rodent's body after death is the reason this entire job was possible. And that mechanism, that tiny window of metabolic safety, is what the big companies never explain, because they don't sell it. The first thing he did was empty his truck onto the driveway, not with secrecy, not with some proprietary formula locked in a steel case, but with grocery bags, a box of Jiffy cornbread mix, a carton of baking soda, a squeeze bottle of pancake syrup. He asked the homeowner if she had any bacon grease saved in the fridge. She brought out a mason jar of drippings. "This is for the rats," he said. "The mice get the sweet stuff." Then he pulled out a second box. Inside were small packets that looked like sugar, labeled Kaput, active ingredient, warfarin, 0.025%, the same drug millions of people take to prevent strokes. And that label, that compound, is where the entire gamble of this job hung. Let me tell you why standard rodenticide is a chain of death that starts in your kitchen and doesn't stop until it reaches something you love. When a rat eats a second-generation bait like brodifacoum or bromadiolone, the poison doesn't just kill the rat. It stays in the liver at concentrations high enough to kill the next animal up the food chain. A red-tailed hawk catches that dying rat, and within 4 days, its own blood won't clot. A family dog chews a carcass in the yard, and the vet has to pump it full of vitamin K for a month. In 2014, the New York State Wildlife Health Program documented over 40 cases of rodenticide poisonings in wildlife in just 2 years. Hawks, owls, raccoons, even squirrels that had scavenged bait. A UC Davis study found that 70% of northern spotted owls tested positive for rat poison. These are threatened birds, and they didn't eat the poison directly. They ate the rat. That's secondary poisoning, and the big companies know it. They just don't have a product that stops it, because the profit is in repeat sales of blocks that kill in one feeding, not in a slower, safer chemistry that only a few companies still manufacture. But baking soda is different. It doesn't poison the animal, at least not in any way that transfers. Its mechanism is mechanical. Rodents, unlike humans, cannot vomit. They lack the neurological reflex. They can't burp either. Their stomach acid reacts with sodium bicarbonate and produces carbon dioxide gas that has no escape. The gas builds pressure inside the gut if they eat enough of it. The result is fatal. But here is the catch. The YouTube tutorials never mention a 300-gram rat needs roughly 1.3 grams of pure baking soda to reach a lethal dose. And that's a heaping teaspoon of bait. That's 1/3 soda. Rats are neophobic. They're suspicious of new foods. They'll nibble a crumb and wait to see if it makes them sick. If the taste is off, the texture weird, the smell unfamiliar, they'll abandon it. 2 major pest control companies had already failed here because rats had learned to avoid their bait. So this expert had to trick a colony of paranoid rodents into eating enough baking soda to die, using nothing but grocery store ingredients and a dead chicken's drippings. The bacon grease was the key for the rats, the cornbread and syrup and cocoa powder for the mice. They would smell the fat, the sugar, the familiar food signals, and hopefully override their caution. And then there was the warfarin. Warfarin blocks vitamin K recycling. Without vitamin K, the liver can't make clotting factors. After about 4 to 6 days, the rodent's clotting factor reserves run out, and it hemorrhages internally. But here is the detail that made this job possible, and that the industry giants actively avoid discussing. By the time that rodent dies, most of the warfarin has already been metabolized and excreted. Unlike the superwarfarins that accumulate in the liver for months, first-generation warfarin clears the body relatively fast. The carcass still contains trace residue, but the lethal concentration for a predator is orders of magnitude lower. A hawk would have to eat nothing but warfarin-killed rats for weeks to reach a toxic dose, and even then, it's rarely fatal. That's why Kaput, a product with a 1940 ERADICATE active ingredient, was the only thing this expert would place in a home with free-range chickens and a pig that roots through everything. Mackenzie started in the kitchen, sliding a black tamper-resistant box called the Protector Evo Express along the baseboard behind the trash can. She filled the tray with the cornbread mixture, a pale yellow paste crusted with cocoa powder, then added a second tray with the warfarin block. The expert crawled back into the crawlspace, headlamp illuminating the tunnels through the insulation, and placed bait stations every 6 feet against the exterior wall, exactly where the droppings were thickest. Outside, they baited the chicken coop perimeter and behind the pig enclosure. The instructions were simple: 48 hours. Come back, check every station. If the bait was disturbed, they'd know the colony was feeding. If not, they'd have to start over from scratch with a completely different strategy. But the expert had been doing this for years, and he told Mackenzie something that made her stop and look at the dark entrance to the crawl space. Neophobic rats almost never eat new food on the first night, unless they're starving. Unless the colony has grown so large that the competition for resources has made them reckless, and the way those droppings were stacked in the insulation. They weren't looking at a normal infestation. They were looking at a population crash waiting to happen, and those rats would eat anything. When they pulled back into the driveway the next morning, the homeowner was already standing on the porch with her dog, arms crossed. She had barely slept, she said. Every creak in the walls sounded like teeth on drywall. The expert nodded and walked straight to the kitchen cabinet, where Mackenzie had placed the first bait station. He knelt down, unlatched the black box, and let out a slow breath. The cornbread mixture had been scattered across the tray, not eaten neatly, but dug through. Tiny rodent tracks in the cocoa powder confirmed mice, but it was the other tray, the warfarin block, that made him pause. The surface was etched with dozens of parallel grooves, the signature nibbling pattern of a rat testing unfamiliar food, enough to deliver a lethal dose. He checked the droppings nearby, fresh and dark, too many to count individually. He turned to the homeowner. They fed tonight, all of them, under the bathroom sink. The story was the same. The bait was disturbed, and a trail of droppings led from the access panel straight to the soft corner of the vanity where the rats had been nesting. Outside, beneath the crawl space access door, Mackenzie found the bacon grease bait box completely empty. The straw packing she had added was pulled apart and mixed with fresh feces. A rat had not just nibbled, it had consumed the entire bait portion. That was the moment the expert knew the colony was in worse shape than he had assumed. A healthy, well-fed rat colony will ignore new food for days. But when the population overshoots the available resources, the old rules break down. Desperation makes them reckless. Recklessness makes them vulnerable. And vulnerability was about to collide with a chemical process they had no evolutionary defense against. But here is what no website tutorial tells you about baking soda baits. The gas buildup doesn't kill instantly. It takes hours, sometimes a full day. The animal retreats to its nest, bloated and lethargic, and dies in the dark where the rest of the colony can find it. And when they do, they eat the carcass. That is the hidden horror of rodent infestations. They cannibalize their own dead for protein, which meant that once the first wave died from the baking soda, the second wave would ingest it from the tissues of the dead. The soda didn't need to kill every rat directly. It turned the dead into delivery systems. Meanwhile, the warfarin was taking a parallel route. Any rodent that sampled the Kaput block would not feel sick. Its blood would simply grow thinner over the next 5 days until a tiny internal vessel ruptured, and it bled into its own abdomen. The delay was the weapon. If a rat felt sick immediately after eating, the colony would associate the bait with illness and never touch it again. That was why the previous company's toxic blocks had failed. The bromadiolone hit too fast, creating bait shyness across the colony. Warfarin's slow fade avoided that entirely. The rats would keep feeding for days. Unaware, they were consuming their last meal. The expert checked the chicken coop one last time. The bait station there was also empty. He collected the trays and replaced them with fresh bait, doubling the amount. Then he stood and looked at the backyard, at the pig rooting in the mud, at the dog chasing a ball, and told the homeowner something she had not heard from a single other professional. When these rodents die, your animals can eat the carcasses. You do not need to bag them. You do not need to poison the earth to bury them. The baking soda is just salt now. The warfarin has cleared. The food web stays intact. But there was a problem he didn't mention. A problem that sat in the back of his truck, in a sealed container he had not yet opened. Because warfarin resistance had been documented in rat populations since the 1970s, and certain colonies, especially ones as large and established as this one, carry a genetic mutation that lets them metabolize warfarin before it ever reaches the liver. He had seen it twice before. Entire populations that ate the bait for weeks with no effect. The only thing that killed them was the backup plan. And that backup plan was something the homeowner had already told him she would never allow. He was supposed to return in 7 days to evaluate the kill rate, but the reality was, if that colony was resistant, there might be nothing left to evaluate except the smell. 7 days later, the driveway was silent when they pulled in. No homeowner on the porch this time. No dog barking at the truck. The expert killed the engine and listened. A house that had been alive with scratching inside the walls for 6 months was completely still. He grabbed his flashlight and walked straight to the crawlspace door, Mackenzie right behind him, with a garbage bag and gloves. The air that hit them when the door swung open was not the smell of decay. It was the smell of dry earth and old insulation, and underneath it, something faintly sour, like spoiled milk. A single dead rat lay in the corner, its body already mummified by the dry air, undisturbed by scavengers. That was it. One carcass visible in a space that 2 weeks earlier had held a colony numbering in the hundreds. The bait stations told the rest of the story. Every cornbread tray was empty, scraped clean by tongues too small to see. The warfarin blocks were chewed down to nubs, the plastic trays scarred with tooth marks. But the most telling evidence was what was missing. No fresh droppings, no greasy rub, marks along the wall, no scurrying sounds when he tapped the joists. The colony had consumed the bait for days, fed the poison through its own dead, and then simply stopped. The homeowner came out to the backyard while he was inspecting the chicken coop station. She hadn't heard a single rodent in 4 nights. The dog had dug up nothing in the yard. The chickens were laying normally, and the pig had not found a single carcass. She asked him if it was over. He nodded. It's over, but the thing he found in the back of the crawl space, behind the water heater, changed how he would tell this story to every client going forward. A large adult rat, easily 400 grams, lay on its side with a warfarin block, still clutched in its front paws. It had died mid-meal. He bagged it and examined the body later. The liver showed no signs of hemorrhage. The intestines were intact. The warfarin had not killed this rat. It had a genetic resistance, the exact mutation he had feared. What killed it was the baking soda. Its stomach was distended with gas, the tissues pale and stretched. The cornbread mixture had done what the anticoagulant could not. In a colony this large, both baits were necessary. The warfarin wiped out the susceptible majority. The baking soda, amplified by cannibalism, took down the resistant remainder. And because the baking soda left no residue, and the warfarin had metabolized before death, every pet on that property had remained perfectly safe. 2 grocery store ingredients and a nearly forgotten 1,940s blood thinner had ended an infestation that 2 national chains called impossible. The homeowner asked what she should do next. The expert told her 3 things. Seal every new entry point you find, no matter how small. Store all animal feed in metal containers with locking lids. And if you ever hear scratching again, you do not need a company. You need a box of cornbread mix, a carton of baking soda, and a jar of bacon grease. The same substances your grandmother kept in her pantry are more lethal to rats than a $50 block of poison from a corporation. The pest control industry is a billion-dollar machine built on a single promise. We have the chemistry you cannot have, but the chemistry that ended this infestation came from a baking aisle and a 1,940s blood thinner that went generic decades ago. The corporations that sell second-generation rodenticides know that their products move through the food chain, killing owls, hawks, and family pets. They know that warfarin exists, that baking soda works, that exclusion is more permanent than any bait, and they also know that a homeowner who understands these 3 tools never needs a quarterly contract. The question is not whether these methods are effective. The question is, why nobody told you about them until now? If you've got a rodent problem, or just want to make sure you never get one, I've put together a full guide with the exact mixing ratios, placement strategies, and safety protocols from this job. It's linked in the first pinned comment below, along with a special offer for anyone who found this material useful. Hit subscribe, drop your own DIY pest control stories in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.